Hi, my name's Olivia, and I am here to make a case for bats and the habitats they live in. I'm looking at bats because they are unique and threatened species. Their presence also can indicate greater biodiversity in an ecosystem. They prefer old-growth forests, as we will get into a little bit in this slide. And old-growth forests also promote healthy ecosystems as a whole for bats and many other species. The bat we're looking at here is not one found in the Adirondacks, but he's really cute. This is a fruit-eating species, and we host insectivorous species, as we will get into in the next slide. But he does melt your heart a little bit, right? So bats are really neat. They're our only flying mammal. They're more closely related to whales and humans than they are to rodents and birds. If you're a bat, like in the previous slide, you're a pollinator. These are the fruit and nectar feeding bats. They are responsible for pollinating sometimes entire species like the agave plant. So if you like tequila, you have to tip your hat to a bat. Bats make a huge impact in pest control. They're little flying metabolisms, the insectivorous species, like we have in the Adirondacks. So they need to eat half their body weight a night in insects. If you're just thinking about a bat that weighs half an ounce, it might not sound like much, but when you multiply that by a colony of 50,000, you'll really understand how they are responsible for 3.7 billion in insect control annually. Lastly, healthy bats usually mean a healthy riparian zone or old growth forest. They're keystone species, so more species exist with them than without them. And they're also indicator species. They're really sensitive to changes, especially human-induced changes in the environment. So if there's something awry, the bat populations will show you. And in turn, you can use bats as a good indicator of healthy ecosystems in areas that might be important for preservation in the future. So besides white-nose syndrome, which has decimated bat populations, sometimes up to 90% in some species, in New York State, the biggest threat to bats is the destruction of their habitat. These threats include development, agricultural intensification, and bad land use practices. Bats are picky when choosing their ecosystem. They not only require specific tree stand and canopy composition, but a reliable and clean water source and flight corridors nearby. Where there are bats, though, there may be greater biodiversity, since these favorable conditions are favorable to other species as well. The destruction of bats' summer habitat reduces foraging ground and creates unfavorable succession of trees. We'll discuss at greater length in the next slide. The role canopy cover plays in bat populations and also other species. The old growth forests that bats prefer, since they have less canopy cover, takes a really long time to establish, 150 to sometimes 500 years, just to distribute old growth characteristics again. So once these habitats are gone, it takes an extremely long time, generations, to reestablish themselves in the species that also benefit from these environments. But bats are icky. I thought they carried rabies and other diseases. Though this isn't entirely untrue, bats get an especially bad rap for carrying rabies. Bats are susceptible to disease because of their highly communal nature. 500 bats can squeeze into 1 square foot of area if they're nesting in a cave. But only 0.5% of bats actually carry rabies, so you're much more likely to get it. Actually, most rabies cases are from dogs, but then foxes, raccoons are all much more likely to give you an infection than bats are. But admire bats from a distance. If you do have to touch one, wear thick gloves, maybe a net. Hopefully try to see if there's a scientist or professional who's able to help you. But we have no vampiric species here, so the likelihood of a bat coming down and taking a chunk off you or getting bitten by a bat is extremely low, unless you're trying to handle one improperly. So let's talk more about the habitat we are finding bats in. Like mentioned before, bats need a water source nearby and flight corridors. Riparian buffer zones provide these. Riparian buffer zones are a vegetated strip along a water source like a stream. These areas are extremely important. They help reduce erosion. They help water systems stay cleaner with all that filtration that happens in the sediment and roots. The shade from the trees help prevent water temperatures from rising, so that's going to benefit aquatic life, fishing, and there are less invasive species in riparian zones, which means more room for natural species such as bats. As we touched on before, bats prefer a forest with less canopy cover. This is most commonly old growth forests that you can see in the picture here. Old growth forests on the left have a much more open composition than the second growth forest. Bats use echolocation as a visual sound map to create pictures and communicate with each other, and that's much more difficult to do in these dense, younger forests with more competition. Old growth forests also promote more biodiversity, better quality of tree. They help filter air and water and retain more moisture, so your mosses and lichens are really going to thank you. There's also more nitrogen and carbon in the soil, and this actually creates topsoil, which is unusual, and then again helps to prevent more erosion down the road. A study in the Adirondacks performed in 2018 studying bat populations in forested zones found that across the species board, all bats preferred a diminished canopy cover, and this led to bats populating old growth forest areas. So what are some land management practices we can use to improve the growth of mature stands? One of these methods is shelter wood cutting, as opposed to clear cutting you can see at the top. Shelter wood logging is a regenerative method, in which case the more cluttered understory trees, say you had a really thick patch of emerging balsam, is eliminated to allow the larger, more mature trees to take in those light and soil resources that are being crowded out by those more cluttering species. This is a silviculture practice. This focuses on the improved productivity of the forest, so by decreasing that competition, you improve the productivity of the established trees. This science includes the study of the life history and general characteristics of tree stands in your particular region. So this practice will be streamlined to the species on your land to promote those older trees to continue to be productive and reseed themselves, rather than competing with emergent species for light and soil. This in turn will keep your forest composition a little more open and less cluttered, provide more corridors for bats and other organisms. So I've talked about the characteristics and land management practices that can be used in old growth forests and riparian buffer zones. But what are the benefits as a whole for ourselves and other organisms by conserving these areas? Older growth forests not only benefit bats, but other species like deer, who are edge walkers, and will in turn help keep seedlings and beech sprouts in check. If you've ever tried hunting in a thick patch of spruce as compared to a nice open old growth forest, you'll understand how much more pleasurable an experience that is, and you'll have a higher density of animals as well. Greater biodiversity, as mentioned, as more mature stands foster more life. These larger, more mature trees create more niches for organisms to fill, so they're more productive areas. They also provide important ecosystem services such as air purification, climate control, soil renewal, and nutrient cycling. Protecting buffer zones will result in better wall quality, reduced runoff by 60 to 90% of sediment without those buffer zones. They provide wildlife corridors for bats and birds, and they help control non-point pollution such as from leaching and agricultural runoff. Those trees really help filter out the toxins before they hit the water source.